decorated U.S. General Smedley Butler described the service to the United States as being a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer for capitalism. Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Iran, 1953. United Fruit, Guatemala, 1954. ITT, Chile, 1973. Can you talk about the intersection of corporate interests and U.S. foreign policy?
Well, they've played a role in many interventions, of course. In Guatemala, as you mentioned, that was United Fruit Company played a major role, and in Iran it was the oil companies, which eventually became BP. But there doesn't necessarily have to be a specific corporation by name. It could be just for, the interventions can be done for corporate interests. In Iraq, it was for a bunch of oil companies, not just one. In Chile, as you mentioned AT&T, and also the leading copper company of the time, whose name escapes me.
Anaconda.
Anaconda. Yeah. They played major roles in Chile. But often, it's just, the U.S. intervenes often just to make the lesson clear to the third world that you can't just stand up to us. There was no reason. They overthrew the government of Grenada and British Guiana in the Western Hemisphere. Neither one was especially a pet cause of any American corporation, but they have to show, you have to give lessons. The main reason we were against Cuba for 60 years, the main reason is that to keep Cuba from offering a good example offering a viable alternative to the capitalist model. That's the main reason we have been against Cuba all these years. So we have to teach them that. In Vietnam, that was not so much for a clear and obvious corporate interest or any special mineral, but in Vietnam was in danger of offering a good example to Asia, as Cuba in the Western Hemisphere. So we have to snuff out these good examples, or these potentially good examples.
Andrew Bacevich writes in his book Washington Rules that the standard line promulgated by journalists and indulged by scholars depicts history as a succession of presidential administrations. The occupant of the White House defines the age. The fact of the matter is, no president starts with a clean slate. Pretending to be role of decider, a president all too often becomes little more than the medium through which power is exercised. If a president is merely a medium through which power is exercised, where does the real power come from? And how is the continuity of American foreign policy maintained?
The continuity of the foreign policy is maintained because it's a religion, and no one wants to be thought of as an atheist. We are taught very, very carefully from childhood on about American exceptionalism, about the evil of whatever the enemy of the day is, communists or terrorists or drug dealers. There's much more dispute in America over domestic issues than there is over foreign policy issues. Mm. If you look at the debates between the two parties every 4 years on foreign policy, there's almost never an issue of principle. No one questions that we should be fighting against so and so. No one questions that we should be bombing here or there.
Right.
The only question whether it's effective enough, we're doing it well enough, and if we're winning hearts and minds and abroad and at home, There's never the basic principle or the morality of it is not questioned. That's a given, and so that's how it's continued decade after decade with foreign policy.
Yeah, it's never should we bomb these people, it's how should we bomb these people.
Right.
Yeah.
And even Obama, in his much ballyhooed opposition to the war in Iraq in his early life in politics, as far as I can tell, he never labeled it clearly as illegal or immoral. He was against it from a tactical point of view. You know, he hasn't questioned. That's the key to distinguishing critics of U.S. foreign policy, whether they actually point out and emphasize the horrible effects of this policy, the immorality of it. That's the key to look for.
In The Better Angels of Our Nature, Harvard psycholinguist Steven Pinker argues not only that violence has declined throughout history, but also that we may be living in the most peaceful era of our species' existence. According to Pinker, in the post-World War II period, the great democracies not only avoid disputes with one another, but also, quote, tend to stay out of disputes across the board. He refers to this period as the long peace. Among respectable countries, he says, conquest is no longer an option. He attributes the decline in violence to a growth in commerce and liberal democratic governments. Do you agree with anything he says?
Well, maybe France and the UK are not at war anymore. Yeah, but that doesn't mean his main thesis, I thought, was that violence in general has gone down, and that's not true. I mean, I just read scattered portions of his book, but I've heard long interviews with him. I don't think he knows the great detail of the violence of U.S. foreign policy. It's easy to say that things have improved for the better if you don't know what's happened. And I question, and the other thing in this book, which I can't think of offhand, but I find very questionable.
Yeah. He also kind of minimizes the violence by focusing on the more developed countries, the great powers, while dismissing modern warfare as something that happens in nasty countries. So, but he never attributes the violence to the United States or the so-called great democracies.
It's easy to avoid a lot of the violence if that's where you focus yourself.
Yeah. Can you talk about the militarization of space? Is talk of the United States expanding its empire beyond the planet Earth science fiction, or is it likely?
Well, in my book Rogue State, in the introduction, in fact in my new book, I have the same thing. I give a half a dozen quotations from the heads of American space agencies, military space agencies. Every one of them, I quote, just talks like the tough kid on the block. We are going to invade space. We're going to control space. We're going to bomb from space. We're going to go bomb in space. This is the way they talk. I have the exact quotations. They're not subtle at all about it. They really look upon space as being the new frontier for them to advance to a higher rank at the Pentagon. They just don't pull their punches. The language, you have to read the language, and it's in Rogue State. It's in my new book. What's the name of my new book? I keep forgetting it.
I think I use that as my tripod for the camera over there.
Yeah.
You want me to grab it? America's Deadliest Export?
America's Deadliest Export. I think so, you're right.
I haven't read it, but...
no one has. It just came out.
Yeah. That's cool.